He couldn't scream when they threw him into the freezing rain. Oliver, a mute Omega, was stripped of his pack. Status violently banished for carrying a fatherless bastard. The Alpha elites laughed at his disgrace, but their arrogant laughter would soon turn to sheer terror when they discovered whose blood ran through that child's veins. The Harrington estate, nestled deep in the wealthy pine-covered hills of Oregon, was a fortress of privilege and perfection. To be a Harrington was to be flawless, but Oliver was not flawless. Born without a voice, the delicate Omega was considered a genetic anomaly, a stain on the pristine reputation of one of the West Coast's most influential Alpha families. He was technically a pack member, but in practice, Oliver was little more than a glorified servant. He cleaned the grand halls, tended to the sprawling gardens, and kept his head down while the elite alphas and betas paraded their wealth. His scent, usually a soft, barely there whisper of crushed vanilla and rain, was suppressed by heavy medications forced upon him by the pack elders. They didn't want a defective Omega, drawing unwanted attention or muddying their breeding lines. But nature, it seemed, had other plans. The night the secret unraveled, a torrential downpour battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's main study. Oliver stood trembling in the center of the Persian rug, his hands protectively resting over his slightly rounded stomach. Seated behind the massive mahogany desk was Alistair Harrington, the head Alpha. Alistair's eyes, a cold, unyielding grey, bored into Oliver with unmistakable disgust. Flanking him were Wyatt, a cruel Alpha enforcer who had made Oliver's life a living hell, and Declan, the pack's lead beta. 3 months, Alistair sneered, tossing a crumpled medical report onto the desk. Dr. Harrison tells me you are 3 months pregnant. Tell me I'm hearing things, Oliver. Tell me my defective cousin didn't spread his legs for some rogue filth in the woods. Oliver swallowed hard, his throat tight. He reached into his apron pocket, pulling out his worn leather notepad and a pen. His hands shook so violently that the ink smeared as he wrote, "I am not lying, but I cannot tell you who it is." Wyatt snatched the notepad from Oliver's hands before he could even present it to Alistair. The burly Alpha read the scribbled words and let out a barking laugh. He won't say, or rather he won't write it down. Probably doesn't even know the bastard's name. Probably some low-level beta who promised him a taste of affection. You are a disgrace. Alistair's voice dropped to a lethal vibrating octave, releasing a wave of oppressive alpha pheromones meant to force Omegas into submission. Oliver gasped, his knees buckling under the sheer weight of the command. He hit the floor hard, wrapping his arms around his torso to shield his unborn child. The pressure in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of burnt ash and bitter pine. We housed you. We fed you. We hid your humiliating existence from the high society of the Wolf elite. Alistair continued, standing up and towering over the trembling Omega. And you repay us by sullying the Harrington name with a bastard mutt. Who is the father? Oliver Wright, the name. Oliver squeezed his eyes shut, a tear slipping down his pale cheek. He couldn't write the name because he didn't know it. But even if he did, he wouldn't tell them. The memory of that night was the only beautiful thing he possessed, a secret locked away in his silent heart. Alistair stared down at him for a long, agonizing minute. Finally, the head Alpha scoffed, his lip curling in utter revulsion. "Strip him of the crest," Alistair ordered. Oliver's eyes snapped open in sheer panic. He shook his head frantically, scrambling backward, but Wyatt was already on him. The enforcer grabbed Oliver by the collar of his faded sweater, hauling him roughly to his feet. Declan stepped forward, producing a heated branding iron, bearing a diagonal slash, the universal mark of exile. "No," Oliver mouthed silently, thrashing against Wyatt's iron grip, but his mute pleas fell on deaf ears. The searing pain against his left shoulder blade was blinding. Oliver's mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream, his vision spotting with black stars. The scent of burnt flesh filled the room, mixing sickeningly with the harsh pheromones of the angry alphas. Before he could recover from the shock, Wyatt dragged him by his hair through the grand corridors, past the sneering faces of the pack members who had gathered to watch the spectacle. The heavy oak front doors were thrown open to the howling winter storm. With a brutal shove, Wyatt threw Oliver down the stone steps. The Omega tumbled, scraping his knees and hands on the freezing, wet gravel of the driveway. "Don't ever show your face here again, Defective." Wyatt spat the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "If we catch you in Harrington territory, we won't just kill you. We'll rip that bastard from your womb first." The heavy doors slammed shut with a deafening boom. The lock clicked. Oliver was alone. He was bruised, branded, and completely, utterly alone. The freezing mud soaked through his thin clothes. Shivering violently, he curled into a ball on the ground, wrapping his arms around his stomach. He pressed his face into his muddy knees, sobbing silently into the dark, unforgiving night. He had nothing. No money. No pack. No voice. But as a tiny, barely discernible flutter moved within his womb, Oliver made a silent vow. He would survive. For his child, he would survive the winter. 3 years later. Portland, Oregon. The neon sign of Beatrice's diner flickered, casting a sickly red glow over the rain-slicked pavement of the city's grittier outskirts. Inside the diner smelled of cheap coffee, frying grease and damp wool. Oliver wiped down the linoleum counter with a damp rag, his movements practiced and rhythmic. At 24, he looked vastly different from the terrified, fragile boy who had been thrown into the snow. His features had sharpened, his posture had straightened, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a fierce, quiet determination. He wore a high-collared shirt, always making sure to hide the scarred, raised tissue on his shoulder blade. To the human world, he was just a mute, single father, working double shifts to make rent. To the hidden world of wolves, he was a ghost. Oliver Honey, a warm voice, called out from the kitchen pass. Beatrice, a stout, kind-hearted human woman in her 50s, pushed a plate of cherry pie onto the counter. "Take a break. Go check on the little terror. He's been staring at the wall for 10 minutes. And frankly, he's creeping out the regulars." A soft, genuine smile touched Oliver's lips. He nodded his thanks, grabbed the pie, and walked over to a booth in the far corner of the diner. Sitting there, swinging his short legs, was a 2-year-old boy. Leo. Oliver slid into the booth opposite his son. Leo looked up, and even Oliver, who loved the boy more than life itself, felt a momentary shiver down his spine. Leo did not look like a Harrington. He did not look like Oliver. The toddler possessed an aristocratic, sharply sculpted face that seemed too mature for his age, framed by thick, unruly raven-black hair. But it was his eyes that truly unnerved people. They were a vivid, piercing gold, a color so luminous it seemed to glow in the dim light of the diner. In the Omegaverse hierarchy, golden eyes were the stuff of legends. They were the genetic trademark of an apex alpha, a true bloodline. Leo looked at the pie, then up at his mother. The toddler didn't smile, just gave a curt, almost regal nod of acknowledgement, picked up his fork, and began to eat with eerie precision. Even at 2 years old, Leo exuded a heavy magnetic aura. Local stray dogs avoided their apartment building. Grown men instinctively stepped out of the way when Oliver walked down the street with the stroller. The boy's scent was still developing, but it already carried faint, terrifying notes of ozone and dark cedar, the scent of his father. Oliver rested his chin in his hand, watching his son eat. His mind inevitably drifted back to that fateful night in Seattle, almost 3.5 years ago. The Harringtons had dragged Oliver along to the annual solstice masquerade, hosted by a coalition of elite packs, using him as unpaid catering staff. Oliver remembered the suffocating crowds, the glittering masks, and the heavy, intoxicating mix of expensive perfumes and arrogant pheromones. He had been carrying a tray of champagne flutes when a drunken alpha from a visiting pack cornered him in a secluded, dimly lit corridor. The man had grabbed Oliver's wrists, his breath reeking of liquor, ignoring Oliver's silent, desperate struggles. Just as the man's hand started to wander, the temperature in the corridor plummeted. A suffocating, magnificent pressure filled the air so intense that the drunk alpha immediately dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. Oliver had frozen, looking up to see a towering figure stepping out of the shadows. The stranger was wearing a tailored black suit and a half-mask that obscured his features, but the sheer power radiating from him was absolute. His scent, a wild electric storm of dark cedar and raw ozone, blanketed the hallway, completely drowning out everything else. "Leave," the stranger had commanded. The single word was laced with so much alpha dominance that the drunk scrambled away on his hands and knees, whimpering in submission. The tall alpha had turned to Oliver. Instead of looking at him with the usual pity or disgust, the stranger's eyes, hidden in the shadow of the mask, but glinting dangerously, held a deep, mesmerizing intensity. He had reached out gently, touching Oliver's bruised wrist. The contrast between the man's terrifying aura and his incredibly gentle touch had shattered Oliver's defenses. They hadn't spoken. Oliver couldn't, and the stranger simply didn't need to. The pull between them had been instant, chemical, and undeniable, a fated primal magnetism. They had slipped into a private suite, losing themselves in a blur of heated skin, desperate touches, and an overwhelming, all-consuming bond. When Oliver woke up the next morning, the man was gone. The only proof that the night wasn't a dream was a heavy, custom-made silver lighter left on the nightstand, embossed with an intricate roaring lion crest, and a few weeks later, the realization that he was pregnant. Crash Oliver snapped back to the present. A customer at the counter had dropped a coffee mug. Oliver quickly stood up, patting Leo's head, before rushing over to clean up the mess. As he swept up the shards, the bell above the diner door jingled violently. The harsh wind from the street blew in, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Oliver froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was a scent. A heavy, oppressive, wildly familiar scent of dark cedar and ozone. He slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway of the run-down diner were 3 men in impeccably tailored charcoal-gray suits. They were massive, radiating predatory alpha energy that made the human customers visibly uncomfortable. But they were just bodyguards. They parted, making way for the man stepping out of the pouring rain. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and ruthless dark eyes that swept the room with calculating coldness. He wasn't wearing a mask this time, but Oliver recognized the broad shoulders, the authoritative posture, and the terrifying magnetic aura. It was Dominic Castor. Dominic was a myth made flesh. He was the head of the Castor Syndicate, a multi-billionaire, and the most feared apex alpha on the continent. The Castor bloodline was practically royalty, known for their ruthlessness in business and their absolute dominance in pack politics. And ironically, he was the exact man Alastair Harrington was currently begging for a financial bailout. The Harrington pack had made disastrous investments over the last 3 years and was on the verge of bankruptcy. Word on the street was that Alastair was practically offering up his own pack members as collateral just to get a meeting with the Castors. Oliver's breath hitched. He backed up until his spine hit the coffee machine, dropping the broom. He turned his head frantically toward the booth. Leo had stopped eating. The 2-year-old boy was standing on the seat of the booth, his golden eyes locked in a dead stare, with the towering billionaire at the door. Dominic Castor's gaze drifted lazily across the dingy diner before locking onto the child in the corner. The apex alpha froze. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Dominic's dark, ruthless eyes widened imperceptibly as he took in the boy's raven hair, his aristocratic jawline, and most damningly the glowing, legendary golden eyes that mirrored the ancient bloodline of his own ancestors. Then Dominic's gaze shifted to the terrified mute Omega standing behind the counter. Recognition sparked like a lit match in the alpha's eyes. The air in the diner grew so thick and heavy with possessive alpha pheromones that the glass windows began to rattle in their frames. Dominic took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving Oliver. He had found them. The silence in Beatrice's diner was absolute, heavy and suffocating. The air itself seemed to bow to the sheer, magnificent force of the apex alpha standing in the doorway. Dominic Castor did not just enter a room. He conquered it. His dark, ruthless eyes remained locked onto the trembling Omega behind the counter, the man whose soft vanilla and rain scent had haunted his every waking moment for the past 3.5 years. Oliver's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct within his Omega biology was screaming at him in a chaotic symphony of pure terror and overwhelming submission. He wanted to drop to his knees. He wanted to run. He clutched the edge of the linoleum counter until his knuckles turned bone white. Dominic moved. His steps were slow, deliberate, and entirely predatory. The massive bodyguards in charcoal suits seamlessly fanned out their hands, resting casually over their holsters as they secured the diner's front and rear exits. Beatrice, the stout owner, had frozen mid-step near the grill, entirely paralyzed by the oppressive alpha pheromones flooding her humble establishment. 3 years. Dominic's voice broke the silence. It was a low, vibrating baritone that sent a tremor through the floorboards. It was rough with unspeakable emotion, dark and entirely uncompromising. 3 years of tearing this country apart. 3 years of hunting a ghost whose face I never saw possessing only the memory of a scent and the phantom touch of his skin. Oliver backed away, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He bumped into the coffee urn, the metal burning through his thin, worn shirt, but he barely felt the pain. He looked wildly toward the booth where Leo was standing. Dominic's gaze followed Oliver's panicked eyes. The billionaire stopped right beside the booth, towering over the 2-year-old child. Leo did not cower. Most grown alphas would have folded under Dominic Castor's direct scrutiny, but the boy simply stood his ground on the vinyl seat. His vivid, glowing golden eyes stared directly into the identical, albeit darker eyes of the man before him. Dominic's breath hitched a remarkably human reaction from a man known as an unfeeling monster in the corporate underworld. The billionaire slowly sank to one knee, bringing himself to eye level with the child. The heavy, terrifying scent of ozone and dark cedar that had been suffocating the diner suddenly shifted, softening into something deeply protective, warm and distinctly paternal. He reached out a large, heavily scarred hand. He didn't grab the boy. He simply offered his palm, waiting. Leo tilted his head, his raven-black curls tumbling over his forehead. The toddler inspected the hand, sniffed the air, and then with absolute solemnity placed his tiny, pale hand onto the center of Dominic's palm. A collective gasp echoed from the bodyguards at the door. Dominic Castor's eyes flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. The biological confirmation was instantaneous and undeniable. The primal bond of a true bloodline snapping into place was a tangible force in the room, making the hair on Oliver's arms stand up. "My son," Dominic whispered the words carrying a profound weight of reverence and raw, unfettered possession. He gently pulled the boy into his broad chest, burying his face in the child's dark curls. Leo didn't resist. Instead, he wrapped his small arms around the stranger's thick neck, entirely at peace within the embrace of his sire. Oliver let out a silent, choked sob. He scrambled out from behind the counter, his maternal instincts overriding his fear. He threw himself forward, grabbing Dominic's tailored sleeve, trying to pull his child back. He couldn't speak, he couldn't scream, but his panicked wide eyes begged the billionaire to let his baby go. Dominic didn't push him away. Instead, his free arm wrapped around Oliver's waist with lightning speed, pulling the trembling Omega against his side. "I have you," Dominic murmured fiercely against Oliver's hair, inhaling the sweet, frantic scent of vanilla and rain. "I finally have you both. You are never running from me again. You are mine." Oliver struggled weakly against the iron grip, tears spilling down his pale cheeks. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out his worn leather notepad and a pen. He frantically scribbled his handwriting, barely legible in his panic, and shoved the pad against Dominic's chest. "Please don't take him. Please! I will do anything. He is all I have." Dominic looked down at the notepad, his dark brows furrowed in confusion, his eyes darting from the written words to Oliver's trembling lips. "Why are you writing? Tell me your name. Little Omega. Use your voice." Oliver shook his head, violently pointing to his throat, a fresh wave of tears blinding him. The realization hit Dominic like a physical blow. The apex alpha's eyes darkened into an abyss of sorrow and towering fury. His mate, the delicate, beautiful creature he had searched the continent for, was mute, and based on the cheap, threadbare clothes he wore and the calluses on his hands, he had been surviving in absolute squalor while carrying the sole heir to the Castor Empire. "Who did this to you?" Dominic demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. "Where is your pack? Why are you living in this filth?" Before Oliver could even attempt to write an explanation, the diner's front door swung open again. The bell jingled, but the sound was completely swallowed by the heavy, arrogant laughter of the men stepping inside. "I'm telling you, Wyatt, his tracker said his motorcade stopped here, in this absolute dump of a neighborhood," a voice sneered. "We secure this bailout tonight or the pack is finished." Oliver froze completely. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen and entirely paralyzed. He knew that voice. He knew the sickening scent of bitter pine and burnt ash that followed it. Alistair Harrington, the head alpha of the Harrington pack, strode into the diner flanked by Wyatt, his hulking enforcer, and Declan, the lead beta. They were dressed in expensive, though slightly outdated designer suits, a desperate facade to hide their crumbling financial empire. Alistair's eyes swept the room, entirely dismissing Beatrice and the broken furniture, before landing on the massive, imposing figure of Dominic Castor in the center of the diner. Mr. Castor? Alistair beamed, adopting an obsequious, groveling smile that made Oliver sick to his stomach. What an unexpected honor. I am Alistair Harrington. We have a meeting scheduled for next week regarding the acquisition of our pack's assets, but seeing your motorcade outside, I simply couldn't miss the opportunity to introduce myself. Alistair's sycophantic speech died in his throat. His grey eyes drifted past the billionaire's broad shoulders and locked onto the pale, trembling Omega tucked under Dominic's arm. Oliver. Alistair gasped, genuine shock rippling across his aristocratic features. Wyatt stepped forward, his fists clenching, his eyes narrowing in disgust as he recognized the former servant. What in the hell are you doing here, you defective freak? I thought I told you we'd kill you if you ever showed your face to us again. The temperature in the diner dropped below freezing. Dominic Castor did not move, but the air around him began to visibly crackle with dominant lethal alpha energy. He looked down at Oliver, noticing how the Omega was violently shaking, attempting to make himself as small as possible, trying to hide behind Dominic's massive frame. "You know this man?" Dominic asked, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. It was the calm before a catastrophic storm. Alistair, misreading the deadly calm, let out a nervous laugh. He adjusted his silk tie, attempting to regain his composure. "Mr. Castor, I must apologize for this unfortunate disturbance," Alistair said smoothly, stepping closer. His body language betrayed intense discomfort from Dominic's pheromones, yet his blind arrogance pushed him forward. "This creature is Oliver. He was a disgraced, defective cousin of my pack. He is mute, weak, and entirely useless. We banished him 3 years ago when he got knocked up by some nameless, wandering rogue out in the woods. Please step away from him. He is beneath your stature." Dominic's eyes flicked to the child in his strong arms. Leo was watching Alistair with an unblinking, terrifying golden stare. "Banished," Dominic repeated softly. The word tasted exactly like poison. "Yes," Wyatt chimed in, eager to please the rich billionaire. "Threw him right out into the freezing snow that night. Even branded the little tramp to ensure no respectable pack would take him in. I'm surprised the bastard mutt survived." Oliver squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face into Dominic's chest, completely unable to bear the trauma of that night. He waited for Dominic to push him violently away, expecting him to look at him with the exact same disgust. Instead, Dominic handed Leo to the head bodyguard standing nearby. "Keep him safe," Dominic ordered, his deep voice eerily quiet. Then Dominic slowly turned his full, terrifying attention back around. "You branded him," Dominic stated, taking a single step forward. The old floorboards creaked. The diner's overhead lights flickered erratically, the electricity reacting to the violent surge of his aura. "It is standard pack law for exiled traitors," Alistair defended. His smug smile faltered as primal fear clawed his throat. The billionaire was completely looking at Alistair like dead prey. "Let me ensure I fully understand the situation," Dominic said, his voice dropping into a demonic, echoing and lethal register. "3 years ago, you threw a pregnant mute Omega outside. You branded his flesh. You stole his home. You left him to die in the brutal cold of the winter. He was carrying a worthless bastard," Wyatt barked in defense, though he took a defensive step backward, his bravado crumbling. "He was carrying my son," Dominic roared into the room. The unadulterated power of the command shattered the front window. Jagged glass rained down onto the wet pavement right outside, the sound drowned out by the sudden, absolutely horrific screams. Alistair Wyatt and Declan collapsed to their knees, simultaneously howling. Dominic officially released his full, entirely unsuppressed true blood aura. It was a suffocating, bone-crushing weight, forcing them into submission. They could not breathe. The air was violently sucked away instantly, replaced by the terrifying burning scent of enraged ozone. Alistair's grey eyes widened in absolute soul-crushing and complete horror. He looked frantically from the wrathful billionaire to the Omega, and finally to the raven-haired toddler in the bodyguard's arms. The glowing golden eyes, the remarkably sharp and aristocratic jawline. The total terror of his realization made him vomit violently. Oliver had absolutely not been carrying a wandering rogue's bastard. He had been carrying the sole heir to a dynasty. "Mr. Castor, please," Alistair choked out, coughing against the floor. "We truly didn't know. We swear we didn't know anything." Dominic walked forward until he stood over the grovelling Alpha. He looked down at the cruel man who tormented Oliver. "You came to me begging for a financial bailout, Alistair." Dominic sneered, his voice dripping with deeply lethal dark venom. "You desperately wanted me to save your pack from bankruptcy. Here is my absolutely final official counteroffer for you today." Dominic crouched gracefully, grabbing a brutal handful of Alistair's hair. "I am buying your debts. Every single one of them," Dominic whispered directly into Alistair's terrified, extremely pathetic, tear-stained face. "Tomorrow morning the bank will brutally foreclose the Harrington estate. Your vast assets will be immediately and completely liquidated forever. Your pack members will be completely scattered to the wind. And as for you 3 fools," Dominic's cold gaze shifted to Wyatt, who was currently weeping in pure, unending terror. "I will personally ensure that no pack will offer shelter. You will intimately experience exactly what you forced upon him." Dominic dropped Alistair's head with a sickening, highly resonant thud. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying calm. "Get this pathetic filth out of my sight," Dominic ordered, "before I decide to end their miserable, worthless lives here." The bodyguards moved with lethal, entirely synchronized efficiency and speed. They dragged the weeping Harrington men out the broken door. The arrogant elite had been completely annihilated in 5 minutes. The heavy atmosphere inside the diner slowly began to lift. Dominic turned his broad back and walked toward his mate. Oliver stared at Dominic with wide, incredibly tearful, hopeful eyes. He simply could not believe what had just miraculously happened. The cruel monsters who destroyed his life were finally eradicated. Dominic gently reached out carefully, cupping Oliver's pale, delicate face. "They will never ever hurt you again," Dominic promised warmly. "You belong with me, Oliver. Let me take you home." Oliver nodded, leaning his battered face warmly into Dominic's palm. Dominic smiled, sweeping the delicate Omega, completely off the floor. Together the king finally took his beautiful precious family safely home forever tonight. They were safe, loved, and truly happy. Did this thrilling Omegaverse tale of betrayal, destiny, and ultimate alpha revenge keep you on the edge of your seat? The undeniable bond between a banished mute Omega and a ruthless billionaire apex alpha proves that true love always conquers the darkest of secrets. If you loved Oliver's journey and Dominic's fierce protection of his family, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow drama lovers and subscribe for more epic story videos right now.